Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to Lawsplaining the Interwebs. I am your host, Nick Rekieta of Rekieta Law, a small law firm in central Minnesota. Apologies for the delay. Please welcome my guests, Sitch and Adam. How's it going, guys?
Hey, going great.
What's
How are
up?
you doing?
Oh, I mean, a lot is up.
What's up?
Got
A lot
him.
is up, but man, it's I've been scrambling today to get everything set. I was going to talk about it just a little bit because of like why I'm so fucking late getting started, late getting to the show. So apologies for that, guys. Thanks for joining me. It's been a minute since you guys have been on.
Yes.
So glad.
Well,
to have you
I
back.
know it's like
4
12
or 5
o'clock.
months.
Yeah, it's been a while. And it's almost 1 a.m. where I am. I know you're
Oh, shit.
tired, so we'll try to be, it's going to be like a chill conversation. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
I prefer chill conversations. Sometimes they get a little testy.
Right.
But
right.
I always try to chat in good faith unless the other people don't. You guys seem to chat in good faith last time. I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be the same.
Awesome.
So,
Yeah.
I was really happy you reached out, Adam, because I had no idea what show I was going to do today. I've been exhausted.
Oh, okay, cool.
We saved you. Look at that.
It was like
always happy to help.
serendipitous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure what this conversation is going to be about because Sitch said he wanted to talk to you about something. So I'm probably just going to sit back and maybe play moderator. Just if something is unclear between you guys, I'll speak up, but I listened to your conversation with Destiny. It was super interesting. And I'm pretty sure I understand the argument that you're making. So, but I'll let Sitch make whatever argument he's going to make. Like, I don't even know what it is. And then you make whatever counter argument. And
yeah,
we'll
well,
go from there.
the hard thing with Destiny was trying to explain, like, Destiny really likes things to be black and white, and the law doesn't always work that way. And so one of the things he kept trying to say is, well, just admit that if the fraud is impossible, that it can't be, or that that's not fraud or something like that. But that doesn't cover every situation. Like, just because a fraud can't be accomplished doesn't mean that a fraud attempt wasn't made. There's a distinction between what's going on with not being able to achieve a fraud and for there not being able to be a fraud. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that was like kind of hard to get across to him. And so that I think was really frustrating. The conversation was trying to get to that basic understanding. And I was trying to explain to Destiny, like, you're working backwards from the concept that fraud exists and then trying to fit in these things that would make the fraud happen. And he made a good point. Like, that's what the prosecutor is doing. It's like, well, yes, that's how the prosecutor approaches the problem. But the problem is that's a biased perspective inherently, because the prosecutor is seeking what they believe to be a conviction based on probable cause. So they've achieved that conclusion and are now trying to prove it. So if you follow the prosecutor's logic, you're going to be biased in favor of the conviction. And that's, like, as long as you recognize that, that's not a bad thing. But if you're trying to approach it more objectively, you have to start from a different perspective. And I could not get him to go back to the beginning of, you have to seek the fraud rather than having the fraud and trying to fit in the puzzle pieces. If that makes sense. And I didn't have a ton of time, and this all plays into why I'm late. So there's a perfect intro, I guess, to just kind of give people an update of what's going on. I did that Destiny show, and then my wife and I went to a tattoo convention over the weekend. And so I was like trying to squish in this last 2 hours of time I had before getting out of the house and going to do that. And as a consequence, I ended up getting a new tattoo started on the last day of the convention. The guy looked at the piece and he's like, oh, yeah, come in at this time. We'll get you set up and we'll get you done by the close of the convention. Well, at the time the convention was closing, it was nowhere near ready. Like, he's still nowhere near done because he massively underestimated. And we had to get it to a place where it was like, at least the concept is there and visible until I can get the thing finished. So I was getting a tattoo until about 8 a.m. today, which was nice. And then I had to come home. I didn't have fucking any sleep. And so now I passed out in the,
This is the perfect time to debate Nick. Look, he's the easy target.
There it
here.
is.
No, I'm awake now because I did, like, I fell asleep and got a nap. And then I woke up. I'm like, oh shit, it's 10:30. I got to get everything ready. Damn it. So
I gotta do something
best.
tonight.
So it's fun.
Yeah,
Fun stuff. But yeah, so that's how my day's going, which is actually great. Like I feel good now, but
that's good.
it's a scramble.
But yeah, no, I also I listened to your conversation with Destiny, and I liked it a lot. I liked that you guys were able to get really deep into all the boring, complicated legal crap that I like to listen to. I thought it was a really great conversation. Everyone was kind of more focused on the Alex Jones conversation, which, I mean, it's entertaining in the way a train wreck is entertaining, but it's not really informative or substantive the way that your guys' conversation was. But I
didn't watch the Alex Jones one because I would only watch it because Alex Jones shouting. Like that's why I would watch it. But like I wasn't. Again, someone had tweeted it out. Maybe it was it might have been Good Logic. He said this is why we it's an entertaining debate, but it would have been more informative if it was two lawyers who understood the law rather than understanding the law.
Yeah. I'm sure you'll see lots of clips of Alex Jones shouting that he dominated Destiny, which he said several times in the conversation.
Wait, he told Destiny he was dominating him?
Yes, he's like, you can't stop me. I dominate you. I dominate the conversation.
That's why he's Alex Jones, man.
Exactly.
He would interrupt Destiny, and then Destiny would interrupt him back, and he'd say, "Why are you interrupting me?"
Yeah, no, it was like classic Alex Jones stuff. But
Destiny's really like this is not in bad faith at all. I had a great time chatting with him, and I told him so. I was like, "Hey, thanks for the the vigorous but friendly debate. Always good to be able to yell at people and like be cool with it later." And so we had a nice like little debrief and stuff. But it was like Destiny, I think, just because his conversation style, and I'm guessing he has ADHD because he jumps in on statements a lot, and it gets. It can be really frustrating, but it can also be kind of fun when the debate gets going back and forth. But yeah, he has this habit of like stepping in, but I don't think it's malicious. I think it's just the way his brain is going. He's like, I got this point. I want to make it right now. And he'll just kind of go. And like, I do it a lot in different ways. I try not to do it as much in a adversarial setting, but.
Okay. But yeah, I feel like in the conversation there was, I feel like that there's some talking past each other and some confusion about one of the main points, which is what I want to talk about.
Sure.
Which was regarding the, because a big part of the conversation was about the ballots, the alternate electors / fake electors, depending on who you ask, and how that, is it a fraud and how that relates to fraud. And so I want to kind of lay out what I think your argument was, and then you tell me if I'm correct. Sure. Which was that, so even if the ballots from Georgia, the ballot said that they were the duly elected electors of Georgia, and that wasn't true. That's a false statement. But so that's a false statement. Everyone agrees it's a false statement. But your argument was, well, it's not fraud because even though the statement on the electors is false, those physical objects, those pieces of paper could not in any way induce the outcome of Donald Trump being president, right? Was that your argument?
Yeah, and Joe Good Logic clears it up a little bit on the on Twitter, and I think he did a review of the discussion that I had with Destiny and talked about it there. Part of the fraud elements is a detrimental reliance on something. So for there to be a fraud, and this is the more legal way of saying what I was trying to kind of just convey as a lay concept, but for there to be a fraud, someone has to be able to detrimentally rely on a statement to induce the detriment. So in this case, let's say hypothetically, someone is going to choose the alternate slate of electors. They're not relying on the alternate slate of electors actually being duly elected at the time that they wrote the paperwork, nor are they relying on them gathering at the Capitol to choose that slate of electors. It'd be going back to the state, and the state would be certifying a slate of electors who are there to be presented as the alternative, right?
Right.
So like the state isn't going to go, oh, well, actually these guys were the duly elected ones that we like they didn't choose them, so they know that those two statements aren't there. So they would have to actually accept those statements, but not be fooled by them. Do you understand like what I'm
Right.
saying?
So yeah, what you're saying is that like the statement of them saying that they're the official electors has to somehow be used by some person or something in order to like make Donald Trump be president. That would be fraud. But if those statements aren't used in any effect, then it's not fraud. Right.
Right. And I don't, it's hard for me to conceive of the two elements necessary to either have a fraud or an attempted fraud. One would be that to have the fraud, someone, either, I guess, the state legislature accepting the slate of electors, or Mike Pence accepting the slate of electors and not knowing kind of the score, so to speak, for him to be like, oh no, this is the real one.
Okay.
I can't imagine that actually being the case. Maybe in some weird conceptual history where this was done like under cover of night, like, and no one knew what was going on. But everybody knew that these alternate electors were not the electors chosen by the state. Like
Right.
I don't think you could credibly say anyone paying a modicum of attention to the situation.
Well, yeah,
was
everyone knew. Yeah.
oh, these are the real guys.
Yeah, of
Like,
course.
so they all understood that these are the real guys. If you accept the premise that fraud occurred and that the original electors were a product of voter fraud, and once the investigation came around, the evidence came out, that they would be turned, like they would have to be withdrawn. That was kind of the concept.
Sure.
So that's, for the fraud to occur, that would have to either occur to the state legislature or to Mike Pence. For the fraud to be attempted, the people doing it, including Donald Trump, would have to be under the impression that they could fool either the state legislature or Mike Pence, right? Like, because Destiny seemed to miss, and we didn't spend much time on this. You have to intend to fraud. You can't like accidentally defraud someone. Like, you can screw someone over by accident, but you can't defraud them in a criminal sense without intention. You have to have the criminal mindset to do so.
Can you defraud? I hate to interrupt, but can you defraud like the state or like the law, so that even if you had like a fake check and you went to the bank and your friend, like the teller was your friend, and he knew that it was a fake check, but he still cashed it. Like, so you're not defrauding your friend, but you're defrauding the bank. Is there like some comparable thing to the government that exists like that?
Yeah. So when you have an agent of the bank participating in, that would be a conspiracy to defraud the bank, or sometimes the bank would, or like the law would characterize that as the Federal Reserve at times, like, because it's a note that,
right.
Anyway, yes, it could be done that way. If there was a conspiracy to defraud the bank where the bank is removed from the decision, and so therefore you have an agent who is participating in this thing. But you're not defrauding the agent, you are defrauding the bank, because they're going to make a detrimental reliance on the false representation by you and the agent together.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
But there is still, like, you have to have the possibility of this being not legitimate. And this is where the analogies get really confused. And Destiny was trying to analogize this to everyday occurrences we can think of, like a false police report or something like that. But they always run into this problem where here, and this is where I would try and get into the importance of plenary authority of state legislatures in choosing their slate of electors, is if they have the authority to choose electors in any way that they want, which is kind of what the Constitution implies. And the hypotheticals he was getting into of, well, California could include illegal immigrants in their vote. And, they possibly could. But if the state has that authority, then there can't be a detrimental reliance, because the state is ultimately relying on the legislature to go ahead and make that decision. And since it's a political question, it's hard to imagine a place in which a legislature could defraud anyone. Because the legislature has the ultimate say. So how do we again get to this point where there is a detrimental reliance to induce the outcome, and who is being harmed by the outcome? Because the state legislature can't harm itself by choosing the new electors. They're making the choice to do so. Again, unless we're to believe that they legitimately didn't know that this alternative slate of electors was in the circumstances in which it came about.
Right. So so the state presumably has ultimate authority on who they choose and the method and manner in which they choose their electors. So, but I guess the issue would be if then someone else than the state took that, choice away from the state, right? That would be an issue. I don't know if that'd be fraud, but that would be an issue of some kind, right?
Yeah, and this is how voter fraud actually can occur, even though the state is going to certify the results. If there is a false representation of a vote, or theoretically of enough votes to shift the the outcome, right?
Right.
Then the state wouldn't be aware of the fraud. The people committing the fraud would be intending to create the detrimental effect, and they would be presenting a false classification of things to do so. So you're gonna somehow generate 20,000 fake ballots that the state will not have the ability or foreknowledge to determine are fake. Right. So they're going to go through the process, and that's how voter fraud can actually occur, even though the state is, theoretically certifying the results.
Right.
Because they don't know that all these things are false, it could hypothetically come in. Does that mean it happens or happens in the number necessary? I mean, that's the big debate in the country. I can't say either way. I've never actually said that I have reason to believe there's enough voter fraud to overturn the election. There are really good questions. Some of the cases presented, I never thought the judges would actually overturn the election in any case. But that doesn't mean there aren't interesting questions about how things played out, particularly Pennsylvania, subverting their own constitutional requirements and how they accepted absentee ballots. But their Supreme Court ended up saying that their state legislature did it okay, even though it's against their constitution. And then our Supreme Court refused to take up the question. So what do we say then? That's just the way it goes, even though it seems like an insane outcome. But then you go back, well, the state legislature does have plenary authority. So even if they violate their own constitution in how they choose their electors,
that's okay. Yeah. Or at least on a federal level, it's okay. It could be
right.
Yeah. The state level. Yeah.
Yeah. The state judiciary could say, no, you can't you can't violate our own constitution to do this. But they said, no, it was good. So,
right.
Okay.
But so if hypothetically, they send the alternate slate to Pence, and Pence pretends oh no, this is the official one, right? That would be fraud, right? Because he's just pretending that it's the official slate. That would be taking the power away from the state legislature.
So this becomes an interesting question on what Pence's power actually is under the Constitution, and it's not clear. So
assuming this, let's just say we're assuming the states do have this authority, it would be taking the authority away from the states if he did an action like that, right?
Well, the question is, so it says the vice president will, collect these slates of electors, read them. And the question is that a ceremonial role where he is just required to read the electors that have come in certified by the states? Or is it a more police role where he is to get the slate of electors, accept objections as necessary, and then determine if the electors that are presented are a valid slate of electors? Theoretically, he could say, I don't know that I can trust this slate of electors, either one, and return them back to the states. Theoretically, he could accept the alternate slate of electors as the actual one. What happens in that question becomes something we don't have an answer to, because we don't know the extent of the vice president's role. And there's some talk about it around the time, is his role ceremonial, or does it actually have some sort of weight of authority behind it? And we don't know the answer. And we probably don't know the answer because everybody's just kind of gotten along rather well with how these things work out. Again, Destiny and I were talking about this later in the show, but it was our government operates on a handshake agreement and a smile and a nod between all the parties, because when things break down and one side flexes on the other, the outcomes aren't always so clear, and they can get really, really scary really fast. Right. So typically the vice president isn't having very many questions.
We're live on your end,
especially now with how publicized information is, how fast it moves, how fast accounts go. Everything is done at the speed of the internet. And we think it's slow, because it's we don't have the results that night, but it's still remarkably quick.
Yes, you are live.
So we're not operating in this dark place where,
let me just check the audio.
The state's wishes aren't known.
You sound
by the time
great.
these two elector slates come in. Mike Pence
sounds fine.
I don't know which one
it
is.
He should know. Yeah, everyone knows.
Sorry,
but
I
feel like there's two
clear.
arguments.
I just prefer not to have extremely whatever. It's a whole list.
Well, I guess the second one is.
I'm fascinated by the reasons, but I think
the vice president. In regards to that. And then the first one, which is I think what you spend most of the time on with Destiny, is how this idea of what it means to be a fraud, and how the whatever the thing is that's fraudulent has to have some ability to induce the harm or the effect or something. And I guess just like, I don't know if this is a good analogy.
How was that? I was just watching Internet Comment Etiquette where he challenged Sargon to a fight, and Sargon thought he meant to debate.
So tell me if you think this is a good analogy. Would be like if I created a fake government document that said, I have the authority from the government to take your house,
sure,
through eminent domain or whatever, and I go and I knock on your door and I, give it to you. Like that's obviously fraud. I don't have that authority, or attempted fraud if you just don't, if you don't do it. But if I, made that paper, so the paper's a lie, but instead of delivering it to you, I give it to your dog, and your dog just eats it, and you never see it. Is that fraud? Or is it not fraud? Because there's no way that like the dog could induce the action.
Yeah, I mean, it's not fraud unless there's some possible way to induce the act. Now, if you had put it in a place where it was intended to get to you somehow,
right? But the dog eats it instead. That's different. Yeah.
Yeah, the dog eats it. Then your intent occur. Even though that's really like that gets really into the weeds, and it'd be like, well, this is ridiculous scenario. Right. But at least you could say, well, the intent to accomplish the fraud was there. The dog intervenes and prevents it.
Right. No, I'm saying like in this hypothetical, like I'm intentionally going to the dog and like delivering it to the dog, thinking the dog has some authority here, but it doesn't. It just eats it. Right.
Yeah. Then
so that wouldn't be fraud.
Yeah, you can't induce a fraud. There can't be a detrimental reliance. There can't be an attempt to create the detrimental reliance. If there was some theoretical where you go like, no, I really thought the dog was going to deliver this and induce the fraud, like then you'd be questioning the ability of that person to be competent for trial. So that's a different issue.
Well, so I guess, okay. So would it be analogous to be like Mike Pence is the quote dog in the situation that like he's getting the electors, but it doesn't matter? Is that the argument?
Yeah. Ultimately, I think the notorious and open scheme of the alternate electors, and this is why it's like so weird how it's being reported. It's like these 7 states operated at the direction of Donald Trump to create these alternate. It's like, well, yeah, but everybody knew these alternate electors were coming in these questioned states. So like they were made. It wasn't behind the scenes. It wasn't scary. Like maybe people didn't know Trump was specifically involved. And again, that's an allegation. How much he's involved, I don't know. We'll find out or we won't. But even so, these are openly notorious alternate slates. They're not considered the official slates of electors coming in. It's like, will Mike Pence be fooled? I mean, well, no. Like he's not going to be fooled. He'll either act in a way in which he believes he has the authority to act. Then we'll have the next question. Does the vice president have the authority to act in this way? Or he'll ignore them, which is what ends up happening, or he'll return them to the states to say, hey, we've got these 2 competing things.
Right.
Can you guys just review your information, verify that we've got the right one, send it back to us? And that could be a very important role of the vice president. But again, until we have the Supreme Court actually lay out what the Constitution means on that, we don't know what that role actually is. Right. So if Mike Pence accepts it, then you have a question of, okay, let's say he doesn't have the ability to do that, and the Supreme Court comes in and says, yeah, we actually have now decided he doesn't have the ability or power to do that. Then do we go back and assign fraud to something that was clearly an open legal question that had to be resolved by the Supreme Court? Because it can't be a fraud if you think there's a possibility that it's done by a legitimate process. I was, again, trying to communicate that to Destiny, but things get jumbled in all of the bouncing.
Well, that's, and I think that's kind of the issue because there's kind of like 2 different elements here that can't like seem like they get mixed together because in the conversation I think both you guys were laying out the idea that these alternate slates of electors would be brought up in Congress, and a congressperson would make a objection to like the quote official slate. And that would create some kind of like 2005 situation where there's some debate about, whether they're going to affect the slate. Right. And I think that was kind of the scenario laid out in the conversation.
Yeah. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there were, and this is not a new thing. Right. There were objections in 2016, multiple objections to the electors for Donald Trump. Yeah. Typically the objections
I don't think any of them went to vote though, if I recall.
Yeah. I don't think so either. Typically the objections are raised. The voicing, like, they voice their concern, and then I think they do like basically determine if there's going to be deliberation and a vote over it, and then it's it's largely grandstanding by a politician. Is what usually happens. But and I believe that happened up until the January 6th stuff comes to a head. They clear out Congress, and then when they reconvene, the people who had planned to object on the later states, since they go in alphabetical order, one of them would have been Wisconsin, I think another was Pennsylvania, they decided to not raise their objections, and then they just accepted the slates.
After that kind of soured a lot of people. But okay. So I understand. So I understand the legal logic given for fraud, and I mean it makes sense to me as a layperson. But I think the issue is that Eastman's plan that he wanted was not to have someone raise an objection. His plan was that these alternate electors would be given to Pence, and that he would just open them and look at them, and he would use them to say, oh, well, because I have two sets of electors, that means that there's a dispute that exists in this state. And so therefore I can't make a determination about which slate of electors to accept.
And the question there is, so?
Right, but I'm just saying that's a very different concept, because at that point, it's not going back to the state legislature at any capacity, right? It's just Mike Pence is making this, he's just deciding to do something.
He's saying, okay, we have a disputed slate of electors. Okay, so what's the next step then?
Well, so there's two next steps that Eastman proposes. The first is that Pence just declares Donald Trump the winner at that point. And then the second step is, if that's not accepted, it goes to the House to vote on at that point.
And then theoretically the House could vote Donald Trump in.
Right, could vote for Donald Trump.
Right. So the question we have is, so?
Well, no, before we get into the I just want to say that that's a very different, that puts us in a very different world than the world of
going back to the state.
What is, because in that scenario, the argument is much stronger that, well, those alternate electors are part of a fraud because the physical entities of the alternate electors are inducing the specific action of getting Pence to either try to say Donald Trump as a president or send it to the House.
So then you would have to go then by extension that Pence is in on the fraud.
Right. He would be part of the conspiracy to, right.
Okay. So the question though then becomes, who is going to detrimentally rely on the false statements to accept the electors?
Well, that would be the question is it the law itself, or is it the state legislature in terms of
you can't deceive the law because the law isn't a thing.
Well, I guess if the law is lays out a process and you do something, like the law says you have to do X to move to Y, and you pretend to do X and you don't actually do it and you move to Y, who's harmed in that scenario, right?
And I'm asking legitimately, where is the pretending occurring?
So the pretending would be if Mike Pence looks at the alternate slate and says, well, because I have this alternate slate that basically has the same weight as, just a piece of paper that I wrote to Mike Pence, that therefore that means there's a dispute when there isn't actually a dispute. There's no dispute.
I have a question for you.
On a state legislature.
Was there
not the state legislature? No.
Hear me out.
Yeah.
Is there a feasible way in which someone, Mike Pence, state legislatures, whoever, could have come to the conclusion that those states were in dispute?
I'm not going to say conclusion.
I'm not going to say under the conclusion that the legislature had selected the alternate slate, but rather that the results of the state were in dispute that would merit some sort of second look or second guess. You think there's any feasible world in which anybody looked at what happened and said, for example, Pennsylvania is in dispute?
No, because as you said, earlier, the state legislature has, the ultimate authority to do whatever they want.
What if they
and then on top of that, everyone knew what the official results were, right?
But what if, or I guess, is it conceivable that someone would think that the official results were induced by a fraud and therefore there was a dispute?
Yeah, but that doesn't matter. So it's up to the state legislature to make that determination. They're the ones that have the ultimate. Well, I mean, I thought that was the idea that we were working off. They have the plenary authority
of the states. Well, I agree that the states have plenary authority to choose their electors.
Right.
However, if the vice president has a role to determine that there is this is a big if, right? If the vice president has the ability, as John Eastman is suggesting in one of the proposed things, to determine that there is a dispute based on a competing set of electors, and then to choose the alternate one,
right?
Is there a conceivable way in which someone, any reasonable person, looks at Pennsylvania and says, Pennsylvania itself is in dispute, not in dispute of who the electors were from the state legislature, but Pennsylvania is in dispute because I believe there was significant voter fraud that puts the results of Pennsylvania into the category of not legitimate. Could someone come to that conclusion?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. But I mean, I guess the question is, I'm not sure if that question even matters in terms of the fraud claim, because he's using this alternate slate of electors as the basis for this dispute claim, when we all know that those alternate slate of electors have no weight for anything whatsoever. And so therefore them saying on that piece of paper that they are the duly elected people for the state would be fraudulent in that moment.
Well, hold on. Answer the question, please. Could a reasonable person come to the conclusion, looking at the 2020 election, that they say, I believe there was significant voter fraud that happened in Pennsylvania to make the electors that were chosen by the state legislature not valid?
Yeah, of course, I think someone could say that and believe that. I don't think it has a legal merit in the situation.
Well, what if that person was Mike Pence?
Again, as I said, I don't think it has a legal merit in the situation.
I think it might if it's Mike Pence, right? Because the question then becomes, does Mike Pence have the authority to say there is a dispute based on his... Now, originally, the premise of the question was Mike was participating in a fraud. But if he legitimately comes to the conclusion that the slate of electors sent to him is based on a fraud in the state of Pennsylvania, therefore he's concluding that the original slate cannot be legitimate. Now there's another slate.
Yeah, but even if he looks at, even if he has a truth faith belief in that, the fact that the original slate, the official slate, is a fraudulent slate, the other slate is just a piece of paper that someone essentially lied about on. So that would still be a false statement. That would still be part of a fraud. He'd be using a fake piece of paper, or a paper where people were essentially impersonating public officials to make a determination in a legal process.
So if Mike Pence can reasonably come to the conclusion that there was fraud in the state of Pennsylvania, again, YouTube, this is entirely in the hypothetical. I don't know what your rules are around this anymore. Losers like to discuss things without worrying about it. But let's say someone reasonably can do that. That someone is Mike Pence. Then we can presume that other reasonable people can come to the conclusion.
I understand. Yeah.
So then we can conclude that the people who sent that the disputing slate of electors could have reasonably come to the conclusion as well that their state was being defrauded. And so they proposed this alternate slate of electors based on the legitimate results that would have been given had the state legislature gone ahead and
with
done
their
this
headcanon
way.
Right. So
So they legitimately believe this is happening. They propose the only way they can find to create a dispute within the state, which is to send. Remember, the state legislature has been defrauded in their mind. They don't even know that the things are wrong. These people are like, we have the evidence. We've seen it. We want to send this to Mike Pence. Mike Pence can then make the dispute about it. Mike Pence goes, yes, there's a reasonable conclusion here. And then he takes the next step, right? And the next step is either he somehow sends it back to the state legislature, or he makes the determination that there's a dispute. Yeah, he makes the choice, or he sends it to the House for a vote. Now, we don't know which of those. Well, we know the House for a vote is the end process, where if nothing can come in, because that's written in the Constitution, like if there cannot be agreement, then it goes to the House for a vote. And that's if there cannot be agreement on the actual 270 number that needs to happen.
Right. Because Eastman was saying that the number could be worked downward, and therefore Pence could just declare Trump the winner.
Right. So then the question is, what can Pence do on the first two? Like, which one of those is a proper action, or are either of them proper actions? But if we don't know the answer and we go, well, everybody in here genuinely believes that there was a fraud in this state and that's why they're doing this, how can we say a voter fraud in the state sufficient to overturn the state's election results? How can we say that what they're doing is a fraud? If they believe 100% that the results are not legitimate, this is a way by which they can follow some constitutional process, maybe, unless Pence has no power, but we don't know. But They can follow this constitutional process to go around the defrauded state legislature and go to the next step and say, this needs to be disputed. How can that be a fraud just because these two statements on there are fraudulent if this is the process by which a dispute is created?
So let's assume, I guess, for the hypothetical that we agree legally that Pence has the authority to look at official electors and make these sorts of determinations, right?
Yeah.
I think the problem is, even if we assume that that is a legal power that Pence has, is that essentially, we don't, like, if we had a situation where, Georgia, they sent in one slate of electors and then, they were convinced to send in a second slate of electors, or they thought there was fraud or whatever, and then Pence makes a determination about which one to keep and which one to not keep, or to throw them both out. I think that'd be a very different scenario than essentially a group of people based on their headcanon making the determination that they believe that fraud existed. And so therefore they are going to sort of supersede the state legislature's authority to choose its electors by creating a document claiming they have the state authority. They're going to send that false document to Pence. Pence is then going to use that false document as the basis in which to make a legal determination to change the legal process, which could change the outcome of the election. To me, that's a completely different scenario than, and at that point, then the lie on the piece of paper that says they have state authority at that point becomes a fraudulent document, because that is creating the action of Mike Pence then either A, gaveling Donald Trump to be president, or B, sending it off to the House at that point.
Only if you presume that the reliance is on the false statement. If Mike Pence goes, well, man, I wish I could accept this slate of electors, except it's not certified by the state. Oh, wait, no, it says they're the duly elected ones. I can definitely do this now because Mike Pence has no idea, I guess, that this is what happened. Like we have to, again, for the fraud to occur, the false statement, whatever fraud you're claiming, the false statement made has to be able to induce the outcome. The detrimental reliance has to occur from that statement.
Right.
So Mike Pence has to rely on that representation, not go, okay, well, these statements are false, but I still have a dispute here because I think there's voter fraud. They think there's voter fraud. Now we go to the next step of the process. He would have to rely on the misrepresentation. But is Mike Pence relying on the misrepresentation? Is he go, oh, finally, we have the slate of electors here that I believe happened? Or is he going, I just don't care about this statement at all?
He is, though, because like the Eastman wasn't saying, hey, let's print out a picture of a puppy and hand it to Mike Pence and then he'll do this thing. They were saying, no, we're going to use, based on his, novel interpretation of the 12th Amendment, they were going to use the alternate slates to create the situation in the first place.
Yeah, but is Mike Pence believing that because
he doesn't have to. If he's engaged in part of the conspiracy, he doesn't have to believe anything.
Well, see, now we get to the next question of it being a conspiracy versus if it's a conspiracy, right? Then the next person has to rely on the falsity through Mike Pence's agent, right?
Right.
Like that's going back to the bank teller question. Bank teller is in on the conspiracy, knows that's not a good check. He knows it's a fraudulent check. So he accepts that and using his authority delivers the detrimental outcome to the bank. So the bank is defrauded, right?
Right.
Okay. Can Mike Pence, who follows a process by which he's empowered to make a choice, and we're going to have to assume that he would be empowered to make this choice, can he act as agent of the government and defraud the United States? In his question, if he has the power to make the choice, the question would be then,
yes, if his choice has to be reliant on there being some kind of dispute via slates of electors, then yeah, he is.
Well, no, I think it goes further than that. It would have to be that his choice would have to rely on that statement. Like his choice would have to be bound by that statement specifically.
If he has to have an alternate slate of electors that are some kind of official capacity by a state legislature, and he has to choose between them, then yes, he's 100% creating a fraudulent situation, right? I mean, you'd agree with that.
You got to the second question, like this is a tough part of this because that next step of having the official thing from the state legislature. Well, here's the problem with that as an assumption or a presumption, I should say. If Mike Pence has to have the official thing from the state legislature to entertain a dispute, he can't ever have a dispute because there's only one, right?
Well, no, there could be two. There could be two, like the Nixon situation. There was two different official slates of electors, right? There was one that was unofficial, and there was two that were officially signed off by the state legislature.
So the state legislature sent two different slates of electors.
Yeah, because there was the original one, and then there was the one that was created after the recount. I don't know why they sent all three, but they did.
Well, probably because they didn't know, right? Like and this is the tough question. They have these three, this unofficial one, they have one that's created, and then they have one after the recount. And now they have to determine, I guess they have to send it to the vice president, maybe, they don't know, to determine which one's real. Like, because we have this official one, which one follows constitutional process. And that's where we get into this tough question. If you, just because we had that scenario though, where the Nixon one comes in with two official ones, does it preclude the ability to have or does it require two official ones to create a dispute? Because if it does, then there's no way to create a genuine dispute except within the state legislature.
Right.
But that would only be after some sort of recount or challenge.
That would make sense, right? Because that would not be taking the power away from the state legislatures. We're agreeing that the state legislature has ultimate authority here. So that would make perfect sense.
We're agreeing that the state legislature has plenary authority to choose their electors. Yeah. But the next question is, does Mike Pence have the authority to question that choice? And we don't know that one.
Yeah, but the problem is, so Eastman's thought process or his legal reasoning here was that they require, obviously you're saying they had to have this alternate slate of electors as this justification to do the action. He didn't make the argument at any point that Mike Pence can just take any blue state and just rip up their electors and throw in the trash can, right? He never made that argument. He said that he can specifically look at these states where there are the multiple slates and say, well, there are multiple slates here, so it's in dispute.
Sure.
But the fact that he's claiming that there's multiple slates when there aren't really multiple slates, there's one slate and then there's a piece of paper that just has the weight of someone in crayon saying this Donald Trump is a president. That's not really a slate of electors.
Why not?
That's just a piece of paper that random people just wrote on.
It's not a recognized slate of electors that was chosen by the state. Right. But does that make it not a dispute though?
Yes, it makes it not a dispute. Yeah.
Well, by what legal process is Mike Pence constrained to accept only a dispute between duly elected electors from the state?
Well, I would say, number one, this was Eastman's argument, was that
right.
That had needed this. Okay. It was not what you said, but was what I said earlier, that there had to be this other slate of electors.
Right.
I think the argument against it would be absurd. It would reach absurd levels otherwise, because otherwise you could have a scenario where anyone could just write on a piece of paper, state of California, I think Donald Trump won, hand it to Mike Pence, and Mike Pence says, well, there's a dispute here. I have a piece of paper in crayon that says Donald Trump won, so I guess Donald Trump, wins California, right? Or I'm just not going to count California.
Why can't we?
I don't think anyone thinks that's a correct interpretation of the law.
Why not? Why can?
Well, don't you think that violates the entire spirit of everything our country is founded and built upon?
What's the last right in the First Amendment?
Well, wait.
Do you know what the last right in the First Amendment is? Do you remember
it? In the First Amendment?
Yeah, it's like the last line of the First Amendment.
Not off the top of my head, no.
Here, I'll read it real quick. Just want to get it right.
Yeah.
Let's see. And to petition the government for redress of grievances.
Right.
Okay, so if Sitch and Adam believe that some state has a fraudulent outcome, why can't Sitch and Adam create a slate of electors to send in dispute and have the vice president make the choice?
Well, okay. So why
can't you?
Well, it depends what you mean by petition, right? I don't think petition means that you can impersonate an official document or impersonate a public officer, create a fake document saying you're a public officer, and then send it to the government. I don't think that protects that at all.
You don't believe that you can say, no, there's a competing slate of electors. We are that slate of electors that would have been chosen.
That's not what the paper said, though. It said we are the official slate of the electors.
Yeah,
but they were not. That is not true.
If they believe that they should be the official slate of electors,
well, no, it didn't say. It didn't say we believe we should be. It said we are.
But that wasn't what I said. The paper said. I said if they believe that, they can send that in. Why can't they? Like,
so if they send
in a process, are we worried that this will actually fool someone? And that's the weird thing. I know, like, it gets so we have to break it down these abstract things like, well, this is a false statement. This is this is this, but we have to simultaneously pretend that literally everybody is fucking retarded to come to the conclusion that they'd be fooled into this or induced into
we don't. No, we don't. Just again, it's not a question of anyone being fooled. It's a question of trying to just create a fake document to worm your way into a legal process that everyone knows is a fake document, but the people that would gain from it pretend is legitimate, right? You're not fooling anyone at that point. There's no fooling.
If you're not fooling anyone, then where's the fraud?
Well, but that was but that's why I asked in the beginning, you'd be, I guess, defrauding the people of their votes, or you'd be doing some other crime at that point, even if it's not fraud.
The people's votes don't actually create and this is the
state legislature or whatever, however, whoever would be the person that you would claim as being defrauded at that moment.
Right. So then the question becomes, again, does the vice president have a role to do this? And if he does, then it is actually a federalism balance of power check on state legislatures in the selection of the president, right?
Right. So, but the thing I wanted to ask you regarding the, Sitch and Adams sending in the alternate slate of electors is that, I'm assuming that if you were on the Supreme Court and you had the case that me and Adam wrote, on a piece of paper, and we gave it to Mike Pence, and Mike Pence threw out the state legislatures and used our piece of paper, how would you rule on that? I'm assuming you would say no, that you can't just, a random person can't just write to the, vice president and him just use that to the state legislature.
Well, I think you missed everything I just said. If Mike Pence, the question is not what I would rule on that particular thing. The question is, does Mike Pence have the authority in the first place to determine that there is a dispute? And that's the real question.
So,
Mike
but
Pence
you can broaden it.
Ceremonial power.
It's 2 points, right? So you're on the Supreme Court and you have this case before you. There's 2 points, which number one, does Mike Pence have the authority to even do this whatsoever? Number one. And then number two, even if he has the authority to make some sort of judgment here, does he have the authority to just accept any scrap of paper as an alternative slate of electors?
If he has the authority, then absent some sort of check, some sort of constitutional constraint on Mike Pence, then of course he would be able to accept anything required to determine that there was something in dispute.
Well, not necessarily.
Not anything required.
As you said, absent any sort of check, right? And that'd be how we determine that he has the authority in the first place.
Okay, so if we determine he has the authority because his 12th Amendment power says he gets to read it, the Supreme Court interprets it as Mike Pence has the ability, or the vice president has the ability to determine there's a dispute at the reading of the electors, right? Then absent some sort of superseding check on that power, it then becomes a political question largely. And that's the hard thing for people to accept, is that if it's a political question, what is the answer? And
but
it goes back to impeachment.
What I meant was, so in the 12th Amendment, the line that Eastman is kind of deriving this theory from, it's open all the certificates and the votes shall then be counted. Okay, that's all it says.
Right.
And so you could, that's why I asked it's a 2-part question, because you could, if you're on the Supreme Court, you could rule, well, that sentence either A, doesn't give Pence any power whatsoever to make a determination. B, it does give him the power to make some determination between official documents, because you could interpret, well, maybe that's what certificates mean, and that's what the, in terms of that statement, it means between official slates. Or C, you can make a determination, well, that statement is vague enough that it gives Mike Pence ultimate authority to do whatever the fuck he wants, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm asking you. If you were on the Supreme Court, are you going with A, B, or C? How are you going to interpret this case?
Well, I don't know.
Well, that's what I'm asking you. I want to know what your opinion on this is.
I don't know the answer, right? Like, so Supreme Court cases like this get briefed by with exceeding levels of research into what was meant. You have a question over what certificates means. Does that mean certified by state legislatures, like openly and notoriously certified by state legislatures? Does that just mean any presented certificate could be in dispute? I don't know. We have to go back and see what the founders wrote about it with the, or I guess with the drafters and 12th Amendment.
Knowing what you know now, if you had to make this determination, where do you think you would fall?
Why? I can't tell you because there's so much research that would go into it. Like legitimately, you can't. This question has never been asked since the adoption of the 12th Amendment, right? So how do you you can't just blithely determine one thing or another, because if I do, then it's going to be based on some sort of bias. Not even Trump bias. Like I don't care what the outcome is on that one, but it's a bias towards either I think the vice president should have some power or not. I mean, I don't. No,
well, I mean, you could do all the research in the world, and this is just true for everyone. All of our opinions are going to be rooted in bias, regardless of how much research we do.
Yeah, I know, but like you can be biased in favor of one thing, do a bunch of research,
and change your mind.
This is what they meant,
right?
Because like, am I like an originalist and say, well, this is drafting of the 12th Amendment and adoption of the 12th Amendment. This is what they meant. Here's the legislative record of the debate. Here's what some contemporary writing and some scholarly writing about it has been at the time, and how has that evolved over time? Do I care what it meant then? Do I care what it means now? A whole lot of that goes into that question. And to me, this isn't so cut and dry as to what I should come up with as the outcome. Typically, I would say I would approach things as a bias or default with deference towards the text as much as possible, but also with some sort of reasonable limitation on interpretation. But what that gets to me
so wait, where's your deference right now?
So the deference towards the writing is that there's something that qualifies as a certificate, right? So the certificates are open and the votes are counted. God, it's a broad statement.
It is, yeah.
So if the certificates are open and the votes are counted, and then you go, well, I have 2 certificates. Does the Supreme Court have the authority to determine what certificates means? Maybe. And if they do, then does that mean we go with an official thing from the state? Or do we just say that certificates are merely papers that resemble some sort of claim to being a slate of electors?
Right. Well, I'm asking you, how are you ruling?
I'm walking through it right now.
Okay.
Yeah. To me, I would probably go towards the latter. Now, you say write on crayon, right? Written in crayon and send in. Absurd argument, fine. I don't think that we would, under my interpretation of this sort of language, just off the cuff here, I would say that probably would be not reasonable to accept as a certificate if we put any meaning into that word. And I think it's there for a reason. But I also don't go that it has to be officially of the state legislature necessarily, because again, I go to this question of, which I had never really considered before 2020 because I never had to, but what if there's a legitimate belief that the state legislature has been defrauded in how it selects its electors? If that's the case and someone wants to raise a legitimate challenge and they go to the state legislature, like hypothetically, they could go to the state legislature, but you got to remember the time crunch, right? This process all has to play out within a fucking month. It's amazing how quick, or well, 2 months, I guess. It's amazing how quick this thing really breaks down when you think of all the legal procedure that they try to put into it. So I go, okay, am I going to require someone to go petition the state legislature, have the state legislature decide that they were retarded and wrong and withdraw their decision and then come up with a new one based on arguments? Or do they go to the courts run into all these problems with latches where, it's too late to make a determination, or they say you don't have standing, or some other obstruction to the legal challenge that all just eats away at the clock? How do we get someone who legitimately believes that their state has been defrauded into having the wrong selection of electors to present a competing opportunity? Where is this dispute raised? How does this happen? I go, well, I think if they present a certificate calling themselves a slate of electors, I'm not sure that that's a problem in any way, because if Mike Pence has the power to say there is a dispute, then you're still within the process. He can make the determination there's a dispute. He could say, you know what? I've seen the reporting on this. We've actually been investigating this behind the scenes. We know these guys are idiots and there's nothing to it. We stick with the original state legislature. I don't think there's a dispute. Or you go, you know what? The state legislature is being very hesitant on looking back at their own numbers. We're not getting cooperation from the state. And we do believe there's a dispute here. If he has the power to do that, okay, cool. Like that's a discretionary authority.
But he'd be able to do that on his head. Like obviously, if he's granted this power, he could make this decision for, California, any state, even if there are states that were not in dispute, he could just, as long as he had an alternate slate of electors.
Yeah, but he would be made that we would be recognizing the 12th Amendment giving discretionary authority to Mike Pence. I don't know.
I understand that, right?
I don't know if that's the right outcome. Off the top of my head, I go, okay, if we're going to have a non-ceremonial role for the vice president, then cool. I'm okay with him having that discretionary authority, because then it becomes political. If you say, well, he did the wrong thing, the whole country believes that it was the wrong thing, this is a fraud perpetrated on us. Well, you now have the political process by which to invalidate it, right? You have impeachment.
Okay, you'd have to, right, unless you just didn't have the votes to impeach him at that moment. You'd have to wait till the next election or something.
Well, but it's easy to say if you didn't have the votes to impeach him when the impeachment is based off of like overtly political disagreements, right? It's a lot harder to say if you don't have the votes to impeach him, if you go, he defrauded the entire country with his decision that was obvious, right? Like that's...
Yeah, but if a specific political party benefits from that, defrauding, then they're, we would hope, right, that our elected officials would have the integrity to not go, with it. But I'm not super confident on either party, not doing that.
Right. But this is the scary thing that I was talking to Destiny about. At some point, you have to just go, the manifest political will of the country does become the operative power of the Constitution in so many places. I mean, if impeachment is the sole means to punish and remove a president, and a president walks down the street. Now, I don't necessarily think criminal immunity, if it's found for the president, would go this far. But hypothetically, according to the impeachment clause and the double jeopardy argument raised by Donald Trump, that a criminal prosecution must follow a successful impeachment. That's the argument based on the language in the impeachment clause. If that's true, then we go, a president could walk down the street shooting children in the head. And if the manifest political will of the country says that that's okay, then it literally is, because the impeachment wouldn't occur. It's hard to fathom that scenario until you think of Germany, right? Like where effectively that, and Germany's not the only one, and it's not always fascist government, but effectively populism can create a scenario where a person gets over empowered because the political will of the country is aligned in that direction. And it cuts both ways, but there is that scenario, and it is baked into our Constitution that potentially that's there. We don't know the outcome on this criminal immunity question, but if that's the case, then and if they defraud their way into office, this actually, I don't know if people know this, but the idea of defrauding your way into office is actually considered by the founders in the Federalist Papers.
So, okay, but just to clarify, to backtrack for a second. So
you don't want to know the answer to that before we backtrack?
I do want to know the answer to that, but I just got lost. I'm getting lost here. So
okay.
Kind of like have a summary here. So you're at the position right now, and obviously you could change your mind if new evidence or new information comes in, but you're in the position right now that if you were on the Supreme Court and forced to make this decision, your ruling would be that you do think the vice president has some ability to make these determinations. He doesn't just have a ceremonial role, and that he does have the authority to, that certificate means something. So it means something between, official piece of paper and not quite crayon, but, a piece of paper that looks somewhat legitimate, right? Okay, so that's your current position right now.
I think so. And again, basing it largely on deferring to some ability to petition your government for the redress of grievances. And I tried to get Destiny to lay this out because this is one of the most frustrating things about 2021 and how it was being reported and everything. Oh, these stupid lawsuits being filed, thrown out left and right. I told Destiny, I said, that's because legitimately no one knows how to file a lawsuit to properly challenge the 2020 election. No one does. We have no evidence that any lawyer in this country could figure out how to raise a legitimate challenge to a single vote in 2020. And we can't just go like it would be easy if this scenario weren't so like half and half of the country. I can't say 50% of the country believes that there was fraud, but there was a significant portion, at least at the time, we could maybe even comfortably say 35 to 40% of the country believe that there was voter fraud.
I don't know if that matters to this specific legal question, what people think in this case. Right?
It kind of does, and I'll get to why. But if you have so much of the country, again, 30 to 40% of the country saying, we believe there was significant voter fraud to raise questions, right? And then you subsequently go, not a single court case even made it to discovery and to trial. Not one. Everything was dismissed pre-trial without the merits being held. To go, how can there be no competent attorneys on the side of believing that there is some sort of fraud to challenge a single vote? How does that happen? And so I was trying to get Destiny, tell me what a legitimate challenge to the 2020 election looks like. Lay it out for me. Because he's like, well, these were all illegitimate. And the media has done this so much. All illegitimate. Right. Well, what is the process? So I'll turn the question to you. By what process should someone have challenged the 2020 election?
I have no idea. I have zero idea.
That's a problem, isn't it?
Well, no, I mean, first of all, I'm not versed in any of these topics. I'm not a lawyer who deals with any of this stuff. But how is this related to this legal question about the authority that Mike Pence has, whether people felt like there was fraud and whether people feel like the courts properly redressed it?
Well, because if there is no redress in courts, right? Because petition for redress of grievances tends to mean there's some sort of either administrative or judicial process by which you can question the government. And so you go, okay, well, there's an administrative process for federal agencies and state agencies. There's a judicial process for pretty much everything else. But if you say there's no administrative process for challenging a slate of electors, there's no judicial process that anyone can figure out on how to challenge a slate of electors in the most recent election with the most notorious claims of fraud believed by the largest percentage of people. What is the petition for redress of grievances from your government that you have? Like, what is the meaning of that phrase of the First Amendment
that you're talking about? Because I mean, there's been court cases about election stuff, throughout the entire history of the country.
Fraud, yeah.
Like, is it just fraud? Like, because I'm thinking, like, obviously there's all those court cases in 2000 that
right over, and that wasn't over fraud.
So it was not over. It was procedural.
Improper, improper ability to count because of this, like hanging chads and all that bullshit. But no, I mean, so fraud though. Like, if you think fraud occurs in the election process, you'd want to be able to challenge that election, right? Like, I think that's not unreasonable.
Right. Okay. So your argument is that, so the First Amendment says you have the right to redress.
I just want to clarify. This isn't my argument. This is my reasoning as to why I think there needs to be some sort of role based on the 12th Amendment that the vice president can find a dispute, so to speak.
But I guess, so how are you, so that's a very, like, that's like, we're not having any sort of original interpretation of the law at that point, right? Because basically,
I have no idea. I said I haven't. So much research would be briefed on this. So you're asking me to make the decision now.
Let me ask a question. So if you did do research on this and you found that, like, the original interpretation of these words seemed to completely go counteract to that idea, would you just say, oh, well, I have a nice idea, but the original intent seems to be completely against that, so fuck that, right? Pence doesn't have this power to do this.
Again, it's a good question. I don't know, because in theory, you can go, okay, well, that's the original intent, which I tend to be originalist, but you can also go, as we have seen things develop, the original intent is strayed away from to a sufficient measure that we make a different decision. That's what I was saying. It's like really hard to just answer this question. My bias tends to be towards what I believe originalism to be, but I don't know if that's originalist at all. So now all I can do is go through. They wrote down some role for the votes to be, or the certificates to be brought in open and then the votes counted. They decided that has to be done at some point. So now I go, how else do I factor in this decision? Like, do I care that the vice president has the power to do this? In principle, no. But if I balance that with the petition to redress grievances and I look at the present scenario and go, how does someone who legitimately believes that the vote in their state has been defrauded and they have no other alternative to petition for redress of grievances but to send in a competing certificate to find a dispute to at least get someone to look at it, well, then I defer to the First Amendment at that point.
Well,
So
I mean, you could give
I
understand, but you could give a variable answer. I mean, I think that'd be sensical. Like if you said, theoretically, if I researched this and I found that the original intent said the vice president was a ceremonial, that would be where I would land. If I did research and found out that there wasn't, it said the opposite of that he had, this power, then obviously that's where I land. And if I researched it and I found that it was never explained or never discussed, then I have this idea about the redress of grievances, and so I would land there, right? I feel like that would be a fair way to answer that question.
It's a fair way to answer the question, but I can't constrain myself to that answer because the original intent says one thing and I tend to lean originalist, doesn't mean that we haven't strayed so far from originalism. Like, right, I'm an originalist, 100% originalist. 13th Amendment only applies to black people. We can enslave everybody else.
Right.
Because 13th Amendment only applied to black people and you could enslave everybody else. It took a little while for that to actually go and say, no, involuntary servitude did apply to other people as well in other contexts. The 13th Amendment had to be applied through some cases to flesh out that. Same with, 14th, 15th, like the way these, not the 15th so much, it's just black men getting to vote. But what that meant actually had to be kind of pared down too. So original intent goes a long way and I tend to default there. But there is certainly the ability to say, okay, well, but now things have progressed a little bit. And on this issue, maybe it needs a little bit more flex. So I don't know. But that's my thing would be right now, off the top of my head, without seeing any briefing on it, I would say, sure, they've created some role for the vice president. I balance in this right to petition for redress of grievances. I don't see anywhere else where you can reasonably challenge a slate of electors given the 2021 circumstances. So let's just give him the ability to do it. And it then creates a political question. We have the process by which this political question can be answered. And we have a process by which the political question can be rectified, which would be impeachment if ultimately it's the wrong outcome.
Okay. Right.
So to me, that makes the most sense at present.
Okay. So, all right. So moving away from your opinion on it, which I understand now, I was curious to pick your brain on in various scenarios, if the Supreme Court did rule on this, would this amount to fraud or not? So like if theoretically...
Before we do, I want to get back to that one point about the founders in the Federalist Papers.
Oh, right. Yes,
Federalist they addressed. Right. So it's in the context of the pardon. And the question was raised, if the president of the United States was elected and pardoned due to a fraud, and pardon the people who commit the fraud for the purpose of having him elected, would that be acceptable portion of the pardon power? The answer to that question is yes.
Has that been tested, or that was just what they...
That's what was written by Hamilton in the Federalist Paper.
Right, okay.
I mean, because they had debated how far the pardon power would go. Could the president pardon someone who participated in a conspiratorial scheme to benefit the president, even to the point of getting him elected through that?
Right.
And the answer to the question was yes. That's how they wrote the pardon power.
Pardoned everyone, right?
They wrote it more broad than they were originally going to, because they originally didn't want to have the ability to pardon for treason. And so a fraudulent election would be treason against the United States, right? And so they didn't want to have a pardon power for treason, but they actually pared that back to determine that, even in the case of treason that benefited the president-elect, the president could pardon the people who benefited him directly. And that's a hard thing for people to understand, because like you're arguing, well, what if the party is participating in the alleged fraud, right? Is that, there's a political answer to the question, that's impeachment. And The power to pardon goes beyond all of that. Like you can't pardon for impeachment. So if the president's impeached or any of the people who participated in the scheme to get him elected are impeached by their roles, like the vice president or the congressmen or state legislators, any of them going through those processes, the president has nothing to say on that. He can't pardon their impeachments, but he could pardon any federal crimes leading up to it, including, again, ones that benefited him directly to get him falsely elected. That's crazy.
It definitely,
on the surface.
Yeah, it does seem crazy. But okay. So if theoretically the Supreme Court did take up this case and they said, no, the vice president doesn't have this power at all. They say it's purely ceremonial, right? That's what the Supreme Court decides. Does that affect the outcome about whether this would be considered fraud or not? Or does that not matter?
If the vice president has a purely ceremonial power of reading the electors that came in from the state, then what on earth could any alternate slate of electors induce? Right?
Okay. Right. So it wouldn't be fraud because they said, well, he just doesn't even have this power in the first place.
Right. Now, the only case in which it could be fraud is if somehow the fraudulent or the electors that were sent in would be done clandestinely and the vice president would have no idea. So like someone actually switches the envelopes. I don't think these are transmitted by literal guy on horseback anymore. Right. But in that theory where there's like a piece of paper delivered to Mike Pence and someone switches the names, that would be a fraud, sure. But I don't think our process allows for that to happen. Everything is so open, so reported, and so notorious now that those electors would be obviously fictitious.
Right. So, well, I guess would another
how
scenario
could
be
the fraud occur?
Right. Okay. So scenario one would be Supreme Court says vice president doesn't have this power. Therefore, it's not fraud because he doesn't have the power. So therefore it doesn't matter.
Yeah. He can't act in detrimental reliance on the fraudulent statement.
Okay. So scenario two, the Supreme Court says he does have this power. And if they give him unilateral power, then obviously it's not fraud because he can do whatever the fuck he wants. Right. At that point. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, but I guess the worst case scenario would be if they say he does have this power, but they do interpret certificate to mean official slate.
Sure.
Would that be fraud at that point or not?
Again, the question would be, is there a possibility that could be interpreted as an official slate?
Right.
To the point that the vice president would detrimentally rely on that statement.
So it would, well, unless, yeah, but again, so it wouldn't, if the vice president was going along with it, right? And then you get into the question of who exactly is being defrauded at that point.
Right. And then the question becomes, what is the check?
Right. But I'm saying if the Supreme Court says, theoretically, the vice president does have a check, I mean, he does have this power, but the check is it has to be official.
Right.
And this
so then
wasn't
you go to
official.
The next phase is, okay, so he's constrained by this ruling of the Supreme Court, but what is the subsequent check? Does that mean that Congress has the authority to make a law defining what certificates is? Does the Supreme Court definition stand? What is the process by which to challenge the vice president in the case that he does it? Because remember, the law is the law. It's words, but words don't matter unless there's some sort of power of enforcement, and we don't necessarily know
I'm not saying there's going to be a coup yet. I'm assuming whatever the Supreme Court rules is going to be taken,
Right. So then we go to the next step of the process, which I don't know what that is. I guess you would then challenge him maybe by petitioning the Supreme Court directly. Like maybe you sue the vice president in the Supreme Court under original jurisdiction because they would hear a dispute.
Well, I was just in the terms of the Georgia case, if the Supreme Court ruled that he has the authority, but it has to be an official certificate, would that then justify the forgery charge against him, which requires a defrauding intent?
Maybe.
Okay.
I don't know. Like that's a tough call. And that's what makes this so hard. Is like there is some conceivable way, I guess, where you could get to the possibility of a fraud once some things are answered. But as far as for this case and for Trump, I don't think there's any way that you can actually do it. Now, I'm not saying that you can't secure a conviction that's not actually based in law. People do it all the time. It's done constantly. And there could be a scheme by which the president is immune from this stuff, but no one else is. or there could be a scheme by which certain actors didn't legitimately believe it, so they were participants in the fraud, but other people did legitimately believe it, so they're not.
Mhm.
You get into really individualized questions about all of this, which makes generalizing very messy. But I think right now the problem is you just don't have the legal structure to call this a fraud in the criminal context.
Right.
Colloquially, you want to call it a fraud, like, there's an attempt to confuse the American citizens into voter fraud or whatever. Like, sure, go ahead. But I get really uppity when it comes to an actual criminal challenge and conviction, because it's so much deprivation of liberty that it bothers me.
This is all, and of course, this is all assuming there's no, which I would think is not likely, but assuming there's no magical, recording of Donald Trump saying he knew he lost the election, because obviously that would completely change.
That changes everything immediately. It's like, we're gonna convince him.
Yeah,
we're gonna convince him that we have. Obviously, that doesn't.
Yeah, right. That would,
and that magic bullet almost never happens in like a fraud case.
Right.
So
unlikely. Yes.
So then we go to the conceptual possibility that there are statements and communications between Trump or his surrogates that do lend to the very beyond any reasonable doubt they did believe this. Right. And that's how state of mind is always proven. It's always circumstantial evidence to prove state of mind, because you can never actually get in there to figure out what was going on. But in the absence of that, we have to go, okay, is this a thing? Well, and even with the state of mind question for Trump specifically, we have to ask if this is something if he can be charged and prosecuted at all.
Right.
He's arguing that. And I think that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to yet.
Okay. Well, it's 2 a.m. for me, so I don't want to go much longer.
Yeah, sure. No problem.
Right. But that, I guess, and I don't know if this is going to be, if this isn't if it's going to be a super long question, then forget it. But because I was looking over the indictment for Georgia, and I think so I see that there's 4. It's jumped out at me. There are 4 charges that kind of were about this. There was impersonating a public officer, forgery in the first degree, false statements in writing, and criminal attempt to commit, filing false documents.
Sure.
The first 2, in the law or in the statute, it was saying that they required intention to defraud or something to that effect, with some intent. But the last 2, false statements in writings and criminal attempt to commit, filing false documents, they don't seem to say anything about that. They seem to just say if a person knowingly creates, some kind of false document. So is that a completely different scenario?
So all criminal acts require some level of mens rea, which is the criminal mindset, the determination to do something incorrect. Now, it doesn't mean you intend to commit a criminal act, because then your defense would be, well, I didn't know it was a crime, right? But it does mean that you intend to commit the acts by which criminality can be found, specifically, and that requires a state of mind that, again, that the falsity is something that produces, for fraud, it's the falsity producing the outcome. Yours is the last 2 charges that weren't fraud, right? It was
false statements in writing and filing false documents.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this one's kind of interesting, because I guess it would get into the nature of what a filing of a false document is a submission of a slate of electors to the vice president, a filing under the means of the statute.
Yeah, it says knowingly file and enter, record any document, public record, or court of the state or of the United States, knowing or having reason to know that such document is false or contains a material false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement or representation. All
right, but so the things you listed out was recording, filing, right? Within a court or something. Again, is submitting a slate of electors to the vice president. Is that a recording or a filing to the United States? I don't know if that actually is, right? Because if you submit those false slates of electors and they're not accepted, are they recorded and filed, or are they just cast aside? I mean, they're recorded by the media, but is that recording them to the government? I legitimately don't know, because it's such a special, unique process. You can easily see how recording like a deed.
To be clear, it was attempt to commit filing.
Sure,
it wasn't filing.
But I just don't know if submitting a slate of electors to the vice president is a filing under the means of the statute. Because again, you can easily see how recording a deed at your county office that's fraudulent is a filing. And even if they don't accept it, you go, and here's a false, like, here's a deed, and they look at it and they're like, this is written in urine on snow and photographed with a Polaroid. That's not a document, but you're attempting to do it. Like, you can see how that's a filing very simply.
Right. But I'm just saying, so these two charges are very different in terms of they don't actually require the intent, the defrauding intent. The intent is just that they know that the document says something that's not accurate. And then they either send it to the government or they just create the document in the false statements in writing situation.
Well, the sending it to the government is, again, that becomes very important. What act?
I know how that's. I agree how that's defined.
Yeah.
Right.
So then the question is that a filing? Is one thing. Two, just because those statements are on there, does that make the document false for the purposes of the argument? And this becomes a big question, and this was frustrating trying to discuss this with Destiny because he wouldn't let me lay out that this is an ambiguity, not an answer. But when you have a process by which all of this can occur, and we don't really have a laid out administrative ability to ask these questions, what becomes false? If these people believe that they are the heroes riding in to rescue the electoral process of their state, is it a falsity? And the way Destiny comes to conclusion that yes, it is because his conclusion is that no one legitimately believed there was enough voter fraud, that this is actually a scheme to falsely take the US election, right? Like, and I'm pretty sure he actually stated that, is that he just believes that Trump fully believed that he did not win.
Right.
And so that this was all a lie that he's perpetrating. So in the alternative, though, that they do believe that there was fraud, and they do believe that this is the way that they have to submit within the constitutional constraints, a slate of electors by the timeline to be ready to be picked, can it be a falsity?
Well, because to me it seems like the most straightforward one, the false statements in writing one, which just says the person knowingly, creates the false document or the fraudulent statement or whatever. I mean, if you say something, if the document doesn't say that we could potentially be the representatives or the electors in the future, it says we officially are one. I don't see how they would get around that in a court based on a potentiality argument.
It becomes a difficult question under the First Amendment because just because you make a statement that ends up not being true to the government, can you be prosecuted? And that then hinges on whether or not you're empowered by liberty to make that statement. And if you're empowered by liberty to say that your statement effectively says the other one is wrong and this one is right, and I believe it to be so, that is a measure of political speech that I'm not sure I am comfortable having a state or federal government able to prosecute. And so I don't know the answer on those two things. We'll find out, I suppose. But the question for me is, what should the answer be? And I am very uncomfortable with the idea that our government can punish anyone who challenges the legitimacy of an election by coming up with a statement that they lied to the government in a way that can have no detrimental effect on anybody on earth, and putting them in prison for it or shooting them in the head. Because eventually all laws end at a bullet. Like if they get knock on the door, time to go to jail, time to show up to court, and they resist in any way, boom, dead, right? Like that happens constantly with all sorts of minor laws. So am I comfortable with someone saying my election was stolen? I've created, the only way I can think of challenging this is to create a competing set of electors under the constitutional requirements that I know of and submit it and hope that it gets accepted or hope that it creates a dispute. And they go, actually, nope, go to prison or get shot. I'm not comfortable with that, because we do have a First Amendment which allows us to challenge things. And I don't see a legitimate other way to challenge it. So for me, that's where I fall in those arguments. It's a principle argument rather than a legal argument or a public policy argument. And sometimes that is the way you have to approach it, without like getting into the specifics of like, what is a filing? What is a false statement? Does a false statement have to be able to produce some sort of thing? I know it's not a fraud, but like, does the government have to be able to rely on the false statement? It gets really into the weeds. and this is something that everyone should know, not just related to this question, but any question that involves speech and a restriction on spoken words, written words, or anything like that has to be, no matter how broad it's written, it has to be constitutionally reviewed as a prior restraint on speech, which tends to involve what we would call strict scrutiny. So if there is any possibility that that the words of the statute would collect otherwise First Amendment protected activity, then it cannot be enforced. The statute's enforcement has to be restricted to non-protected activity in some way, either limited by the how the state prosecutes it, limited by how the courts interpret it. And so just reading the statute that has a limit on speech, I mean, I have to try and figure out without doing a shitload of research into how that's done. But to me, I'd be very wary of a government that can punish people questioning the legitimacy of the election or even challenging it in a manner by which seems to be one of the only ones that was available with prison time. I have a problem with that.
I mean, regarding that argument, because I mean, I understand you're making an argument based on the principle and not like the legal question.
Well, again, the researching how Georgia interprets that.
Sure, I understand. That's a whole project.
First Amendment is a problem. Is something I haven't done.
But in terms of what you were laying out there, because I think the problem is though that, you know, if you're going to make the argument that the creation of the official, of the unofficial, of the fake or alternative slate of electors doesn't have any ability to have any effect, then that undermines the argument that this is the only way in which they could use their free speech to protest or redress the government. Because if it doesn't have any effect, then, you know, standing outside of the White House with a sign that has no effect would be the same thing, would be the same action, right?
Not quite. So not having an effect is different from not having a detrimental effect, right? And again, this goes back to the question of, does the falsity of the statement matter? And that's the ultimate fraud question. That's the ultimate question with the false statement, in my opinion, because if I go lie to the government, right? Like even if it's in writing, but it doesn't do anything or can't, like if I like just go to the government and I write down on paper, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey likes women, he's a heterosexual. If I just write that down and give it to the government, like that doesn't matter.
Right.
So I've lied to the government there. Guy's clearly a flaming homosexual. So I definitely have lied to the government if I say that. So have I committed a crime though? Like I've made a false statement to the government. It gets a little more like the false statement has to matter. And this question is, why does this statement on the paper matter? It looks to me like it's a pro forma sort of statement for the certificate that the state is created by its processes.
Well, it matters if it's required to get it into Pence's hands, right? As opposed to writing, you know, in crayon on a piece of paper, then it does matter. If it does, if Pence has ultimate authority to accept, you know, a dog turd that you posted a picture of Trump on, then I guess it wouldn't matter at that point.
And that's another question. This is where it like goes down the chain of first of all, does that requirement matter or does that requirement exist?
Well, actually, I mean, I guess does it any of these questions, because we're kind of looking at this from a federal perspective, from the state of Georgia perspective, it would doesn't that change everything? Because they're saying, well, we don't believe our state legislature was defrauded, so fuck you, right?
Yeah, but then the question is, how did we defraud Georgia under Georgia law? Like, how did we do that?
No. But I'm saying in terms of like the whole, just going back to the false statements thing. If they believe that this false statement has an effect or a potential effect of getting Mike Pence to do some action where he goes against what their state legislature, you know, said, you know, from a state perspective, couldn't they just say, well, you know, fuck you? Like they don't really care about this from a federal perspective that you're kind of laying out here.
Right. And then the subsequent, I guess, defense would be, okay, like if you don't care about like the state being defrauded or whatever, what interest do you have in this thing? Because Georgia wasn't defrauded.
No. Georgia's position
I know.
Is that they don't think they're defrauded.
Right. But no. I'm talking about the false statement though, because the false statement isn't made to Georgia, right? The false statement in this case is made to Mike Pence in theory. right?
Right, but it would have it's using Georgia. It's like pretending that they have the authority of Georgia when they don't, right?
Right, but then the
that
defense would be how does
crime,
Georgia
right?
have a claim over this because it's not impacting Georgia. Now maybe they do, maybe they don't, but that's part of the defense, right? Is like, again, why does I'm not making a false statement to Georgia, I'm making a false statement to the vice president of the United States.
Well, presumably if
why are you
if you
challenging
threw out
that?
the slate of electors from Georgia, that'd be the impact it would have on Georgia, right?
Maybe, I guess.
Maybe it would have. That would be the impact it would have on Georgia.
I believe that can happen, and then that becomes the question. But if it can happen because of it, does Georgia have the ability to prevent people redressing their grievances to the government, the federal government? Because, like, again, we get down to this cascading question. At what point does someone get to restrict speech for their own interest?
Right.
When their interest is government. If the feds can't do it because Mike Pence has the power to do this, and that's a First Amendment right to go ahead and do this, like under this hypothetical, right? This is a First Amendment right. It's covered political speech and it is petition for redress of government. Georgia can't just say, well, the feds won't prosecute you, but I will, because they'd be similarly constrained by the First Amendment considerations. So then, no, they wouldn't be able to care because it becomes a political question then with a political answer.
Right.
Is how I would think that would work out. Because we can't just say, well, the feds can't prosecute it, but the state can because the state doesn't like it. Well, if the state doesn't like it, too bad. I mean, if it's protected speech, it's protected. But that's all assuming that there is a First Amendment right to do any of this.
Right.
And maybe there isn't. I don't know. Tough questions.
Okay. Well, the last thing I want to ask, this has been a very interesting conversation. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem, man.
Does it matter if Eastman himself, admits or is testified by someone else to admitting that he not only believes that the action that he's doing is illegal, but that he believes that if this went to Supreme Court, that he would lose handily? Does that have any impact on the criminality or anything about this case?
That's a tough call. Believing that, thinking that you have a legal outcome that will be negative is not the same as believing something should be fully illegal. So I'd have to see the statements, I guess. Has he made some sort of statement like that?
So,
or was it like, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So Pence's lawyer said or testified during one of the January 6th committee hearings that they were having a conversation where they were kind of going through this strategy. And in the conversation, Pence's lawyer said, the Supreme Court is not going to side with you. And originally Eastman said he agreed, but that he was banking on the fact the Supreme Court wouldn't even hear it. And then in a different conversation, when they talked about this again, and I forget the guy's name, Pence's lawyer's name, Greg Jacobs said that he thought that the Supreme Court would hear it and that they would lose 9-0. And Greg Jacobs claims that by the end of the conversation, Eastman agreed that the Supreme Court would probably hear this, or if they did hear this, they would lose 9-0.
No, I don't think that's from what you just said. I don't think that that's a problem at all.
Okay.
Because believing that you have a right to do something and thinking the Supreme Court will rule against that right does not mean that you don't believe that you have the right to do it.
Would it hurt in terms of maybe not criminal charge, but like him being disbarred? Like, how are you giving your client this advice to do this action?
No, because if you give your client the advice and say, look, it's a long shot, I don't think we're going to win, but ultimately it's up to you to determine the way we go about this. Here's your advice. I think we lose 9-0. I don't think maybe we should do it. Or I think maybe we should do it to get this out and lay this down. What
if he doesn't tell Trump that he thinks they're going to lose 9-0? Because I think he told this to Pence's lawyer. I don't know if he told Trump this.
Well, then the other question is, what duty of candor and honesty does he have to Pence's lawyer?
Well, assuming he's not lying, right? Assuming he's telling.
But I mean,
at that moment,
let's say Pence's lawyer though is 100% correct in what Eastman says, but maybe Eastman's just lying to that guy.
Right. I understand that, but I'm just saying, theoretically, Eastman says, yes, I said that, and that was my position at the time. He agrees that is his position.
Then, I mean, it would be up to Trump to, I guess, bring some sort of ethics complaint against him for leading him astray or not telling him of the things. But we have to now we're getting into the hypotheticals of what happened between him and Trump, which probably in Trump's interest for that to never come out either way.
Sure.
So
unless he tries to pin the blame and say, he told me it was legal.
Yeah. If he claims he's relying on advice of counsel and then he opens, that's been one of the big news stories is that if he makes that claim, then he necessarily forfeits privilege on that issue. And then his attorney-client communications become, open to the other side.
Could be dangerous. Yeah.
Could be, right. Or it could not. Depends on
what he said. Right. Sure.
What's said. Right. But so then, that's what clients always have to do when they're weighing out their either a reliance argument for, reliance on counsel, or if they're trying to say that their counsel made representations that were unethical to them, or they didn't properly advise them. They have to weigh out the possibility that those statements could then become matter of record and then could be used in some way and they would lose privilege on them. So, that would come from Trump though. That's Trump's right, not Eastman's and not Pence's lawyer's right. Pence's lawyer can only represent what Eastman said to him. And Eastman has no duty to be honest with that guy. He could just be trying we're probably going to lose 9-0, but you know what? Fuck it. Let's give it a shot, right? Let's see what we can ride the law here. But he could just be, it could be puffery. It could be collegial back and forth with a friend. And it's hard to really get into that with a statement. So I don't think that they have, a jury could find them persuasive. They would have to come in over a hearsay objection, and that would probably be argued because it is a statement against interest of Eastman, but it could be allowed in, but the judge would have to weigh if it was actually probative enough to outweigh its prejudicial impact, because it'd be highly prejudicial to a jury, even though
if it didn't have any impact. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, he may have every right to say that to another lawyer. Like you can lie to another lawyer as long as it's not in official documents, right?
Right.
Or if you're not in an active case and your communications back and forth in the context of a case. But if you're just discussing something in the hypothetical, or Pence's lawyer's like, no, he can't do this. And he's like, yeah, well, I don't know if he can do it either. We're probably going to lose on the issue, but we're going to press on it. There's no requirement of candor at that point. So he can say whatever he wants to kind of affect the outcome in the way he plans. But
all right,
I don't recommend that shit, by the way.
Not a good idea. Yeah. Not a good idea.
My recommendation is always speak with candor to the other counsel to the limits of your duty to your client, especially because this shit can come back and bite you. So usually it's just a good idea to tell the fucking truth, especially in any communication as a lawyer representing a client. That is critical. But that doesn't mean that you have to, in all communications, tell the truth. There all sorts of reasons, as long as you don't have a duty or obligation to the truth in that scenario, to not. So try to avoid those if you're young budding lawyers. But
yeah, definitely. Okay, well, thanks. I mean, I think I probably disagree with most of your positions on this, but I think you make very interesting and probably the best counter arguments I've heard, or defense arguments I've heard. So it's a really interesting conversation.
I don't mind if anybody disagrees with me or anything on any of this stuff, because I don't know the answer. I know my opinions on how things should shape out based on my understanding of law, based on my understanding of the Constitution, and then based, of course, like you said, everything goes into with bias. My bias tends towards liberty and the maximum ability to challenge government. And so if you ask me how I want things to work out, I want people to be able to challenge something that they don't think was legitimate. And I go, how on earth do you do that in this scenario? I don't want people punished for thinking there was fraud. And we've seen, can you give me that we've seen not necessarily a legal punishment, but there has been a severe, open public backlash against people who challenge legitimacy of the election. And one of the scary ones is, in my opinion, there has been an actual, not criminal, but there has been a disciplinary retaliation against people who represented January 6th defendants, represented quote unquote election deniers, and people who filed lawsuits in those states. Have you seen what is happening to attorneys who represented this stuff? They're being ethically disciplined like crazy. And that's terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I think if lawyers who are just defending clients are getting in trouble, not legally, but just disciplined in some fashion, I mean, I think that's really wrong. Obviously, everyone should be entitled to a lawyer. And I am sympathetic that, obviously we, have very strong free speech laws in America, and I support that. I'm not a free speech absolutist. I don't think really anyone is, and I think people should be able to question the election. I don't like that YouTube or some of these other, platforms get very upset when you do that. But the same token, I do understand the emotion on the other side, because it basically all hinges on whether or not you thought the election was stolen. Because if you think the election was not stolen, your worldview is essentially that half the country is engaged in some process that is heavily damaging, the potential peaceful transition of power institution that could lead to some kind of, civil war or some kind of conflict. And so therefore you're very energized and upset about it. And if you do believe the election was stolen, you have the exact same view, but just in the opposite direction, that, they stole the election from us, thus, screwing us over on the peaceful transition of power. So I do understand why everyone's very animated on it on both sides.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, I don't know. I don't know if it was stolen. I don't know if it wasn't stolen. To me, the most interesting stuff there were a couple cases that I thought had really, really great questions in them, whether or not, and my position was always, I don't think any judge, and I don't think any panel of judges was going to overturn the election. Especially not with Roberts as head of the Supreme Court. I didn't think so at all. But I thought the Pennsylvania question is great. Can a state ignore its own constitutional requirement to create a constitutional amendment, utilize that constitutional amendment to accept votes that it wouldn't have otherwise accepted, in particular absentee ballots in Pennsylvania, to a higher measure than before? Can they do that, violating their own constitution, and then have their results be quote unquote legitimate? The Pennsylvania Supreme Court said yes. So then it was brought to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I didn't want them to just ignore the question. I would love to have them, even though I don't think they were going to overturn. Pennsylvania itself wouldn't have overturned the election, so it would have been a safe one to answer. But I do think that maybe the Supreme Court should weigh in on whether or not a state constitution can bind a state to its own actions when it comes to a federal election, because plenary authority of the state legislature could supersede even the state Supreme Court and the state's constitutional process. But do we want that to be the case? Is that allowable? Does that violate federalism? I don't know the answer. I just wanted one from the Supreme Court to say, yeah, states have the authority to determine the enforceability of their own constitution, which plays into the plenary authority of state legislatures. Cool. Great answer. Or no, they don't, because this impacts a federal election and then violates the compact of states that are all participating. Cool. Great answer. Let's just get one. And then I think Texas v. Georgia had some interesting questions as well. And Destiny says, well, what was the injury? It's like, well, I don't know. Maybe the Supreme Court could answer that question on whether or not a state has the power to sue another state over what it perceives to be fraudulently selecting electors. Again, do we get into plenary authority, or is there a compact of states that requires some level of legitimacy, whatever that is? Like, what constitutes legitimacy? Are states' rights impacted by other states' decisions, or, frauds that the states are complicit with or unaware of? Like, what is the limit between this? And my big problem with that was that is a case that the Supreme Court should have had original jurisdiction on. They pushed out on standing grounds. It's like, well, I don't know that you can do that, especially with Trump as one of the plaintiffs. And that bothers me that they won't just go in and answer the question. Again, it wouldn't overturn the election if it's just Georgia. Even just Georgia and just Pennsylvania would not have been sufficient. But if a state can challenge another state's choosing of electors at all is a good question. And how would they do it? Do they do it through the courts? Do they go straight to the Supreme Court like you would think they do? The Supreme Court just said standing. It's like, wait, but it literally says in your original jurisdiction, a dispute between two states comes out to the Supreme Court hears the case. So how do we get a standing issue there? The standing is constitutional, but you can't appeal that up. There's nowhere to go. So that I wanted those questions answered. I really, people get me wrong on this. Like, I'm indifferent on the outcomes because whatever I think about fraud, no fraud isn't really relevant as long as the Constitution is followed in the way that we understand it. I just think there's so much about this question or these questions that we don't have the understanding from the Constitution. So we should flesh it out when we have the opportunity is my thing.
Okay.
But
well, thanks for the conversation. So
one question before you go, Nick. What's your
Adam, you're here.
What's your position on the gold standard?
Man, that's a tough one too. Because
look, we don't have all night, so I'll ask you next time.
No, I'll make it quick. I'll make it very quick. The gold standard is a really cool concept, but the Constitution gives Congress the authority to mint money and stake the value thereof. So the gold standard is a great idea, but it's not like a constitutional slam dunk. Congress has the ability to do it. Fiat currency has a lot of disadvantages, but it also has a shitload of advantages when you're top dog in the world. We've enjoyed them for a long time as the most powerful economy because other currencies are set to ours. The risks come when our currency gets marked to another currency that's dominant. We really start to run massive economic problems under fiat standard. So if we ever become like a bitch country and get subsequent to China or some other currency becomes a standard, we should really look at setting the value of our currency based on a hard asset at that point. But
wow,
I mean,
look, I'm not sure I agree with that last part, but yeah, no, you know a lot about currency, which is awesome. Yeah, great.
I know a lot about a lot. I know enough
it helps
about
to be the most
too many
stable
subjects.
Currency in the world.
It does. It does.
It helps to be the reserve currency. It definitely does.
And when you are, you get to leverage unfathomable amounts of debt in your favor with no real need to pay. Like, I know we have a conceptual need to pay them off, but at some point we could just kind of say, fuck off, go to war with us, or let's negotiate it down. Fiat currency allows that. It's not the best outcome on the longest timeline, but it is one that we've taken great advantage of and built up our economy pretty well with it. So
were you talking about this? The 65 project, the group of lawyers that were going after President Trump's, the people there. Okay, they file this. There's like the 65 project that are going after the 100 lawyers that filed these lawsuits to overturn the election. I thought you were talking about lawyers going after other lawyers. That's some scary shit.
I haven't seen that particularly. I've just seen the disciplinary decisions coming from people who filed this stuff. And it's real easy to look at disciplinary boards' decisions on whether they presented sufficient cases, et cetera. But knowing that the political leanings of disciplinary boards around attorneys, if you have not heard the expression that for like every lawyer that exists, there's a liberal lawyer. I just made that up right now. That's why you haven't heard it, but it's pretty fucking true. The liberal nature of the legal profession makes political punishment a very real question on a situation like this. And so I have real trouble going with state ethics decisions on lawyers who happen to represent Trump in a question where I still can't find any attorney who could tell me how specifically to sue the government in 2020 over the election and have any result. So how can you say these people all brought cases, blah, blah, blah. Now, some of them brought bad cases. One of them was Sidney Powell. She brought a case in Michigan challenging the vote districts, right? And the evidence presented, I found this incidentally just because I happened to live in Minnesota, and I noticed that all the counties where she said there were disputed vote totals were Minnesota counties, and they weren't Michigan counties. But I knew that because like I lived in a couple of those counties through the years. I was like, wait, does Michigan really have these counties in it too? Like, I guess because we're in the Midwest and there could be the same Indian tribes that they're all named after, but I don't know. So I checked, and of course they don't. And I was like, well, that was some shitty lawyering right there. But no one ever said Sidney Powell was a great lawyer, I guess. She got some good results in other stuff, but in the election, I thought her Kraken lawsuits were hilariously bad, made fun of all of them. So maybe she deserves some project.
This is a project of 100 independent lawyers that are going after the lawyers that filed lawsuits. It's called the 65 Project because I guess there were 65 lawsuits filed to overturn the 2020 election. So they're going after all of those attorneys that filed those lawsuits to get them disbarred and discredited. That's some fucking scary shit.
That's not stuff that I like, actually, at all. Because again, I see Pisco in the chat. Hey, buddy. He says there were many ways to win. If you could show that an election had outcome determinative fraud, you could have the entire election thrown out. There are state mechanisms for this. Yeah, sure there are. If the state's defrauded and refuses to actually go into looking into the evidence beyond recounts, to do audits, refuses to turn over the data to independent reviewers, then the state processes don't matter for shit. So your option is to sue. Everyone who tried every lawsuit wasn't able to bring one. And you cannot tell me that there was not a single competent attorney anywhere to be found who could conceive a case to do this, that they're all just lying, being unethical, trying to bring these cases. No one could bring a competent case in 2020. And I really would love to see any lawyer claim one could have been brought and lay out what it would be.
Look, these attorneys, they took their shot and they got shot down in court or whatever. Why go after them just for bringing the case? That's what seems completely vindictive. Yeah. 100%
agree with you. Unless, again, now there are some, I do think Sidney Powell could be disciplined in some way. I mean, I think she's voluntarily been disbarred and apologized for the defamation stuff. But I think she could have been punished some way for that Michigan case, because she presented evidence that was clearly not from Michigan. I mean, it's from Minnesota. Pretty obvious to find if you do any review. So she just didn't do her due diligence there.
Yeah, but it's the court's job to discipline her, not for these independent. I mean, it's basically like vigilante lawfare.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I agree that it's not up to other lawyers to do it, that it would be up to someone impacted by that to go ahead and do it. And the court could go ahead and implement those sanctions or recommend them for disciplinary action for sure. I don't think that's the job of independent lawyers. So,
well, and
but hey,
look, if
lawyers
there's
are
a
assholes.
legitimate, if there's a legitimate grievance, like let's say, some shenanigans really take place and somebody needs to file a lawsuit, attorneys are going to be terrified to do it because of this nonsense. It's like
and that's
setting
why
us up for failure. Yeah.
100% why it's happening.
Anyway, so we have a couple super chats to read. I guess, Sitch, I should send you.
When we leave Nick's stream, does our stream end? How's it going to work?
No, our stream's still going, but I'll send you a Zoom link.
Okay, so we can just do that. Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining us. Wait, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'll let you guys off of my stream, go carry on, Sally forth and all that good stuff. I really appreciate you guys coming on. And it's a great discussion. I love being able to actually talk through the issues. The thing I hated about the discussion with Destiny was like, we kept getting in a loop on these basic concepts that were hard for him to grasp. I don't know if it was because of his argumentative style or whatever, but again, no ill will or malice towards him. It was just frustrating to stay on that one subject. It's like, can we just get past this thing? Even if we disagree, can we just move to the next thing? But here we were able to kind of get around some of that stuff. I really enjoyed it. So thanks.
Yeah, man, the argument that you're making is very confusing and seemingly intuitively wrong. So I think I have the benefit because I listened to the conversation and thought about it. Where if I was hearing what you were saying for the first time, I would probably be like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah, and that's the shitty part of law is we want the law to be intuitive, understandable. It's supposed to be, but it ends up not being. And then the other thing we want the law to produce outcomes which make us comfortable that the security of the state itself is fine. But it doesn't always do that. Right. And especially in regards to constitutional authority. And we go, wait, how many steps are we away from a dictatorship? Sure.
But if I was on the Supreme Court, I would say Pence doesn't have this power, and all these people should be locked up for fraud, baby. And slam the gavel down.
If Pence doesn't have the power, then they can't defraud him.
It doesn't matter. I'm on the Supreme Court. I can say whatever I want.
That's right. Supreme Court ordered executions. Get them.
There it is. I'll have my own. Listen, I'll have my own judgment. Okay.
As long as I'm Chief Justice, I support Supreme Court issued executions.
True, and based.
Vote for me for Chief Justice. I'm pretty sure that's how it works.
That's how it works.
All right, guys. Thanks for coming.
Nick. Thanks for doing this.
Take care.
Yeah, have a good night. Until next time.
You too.
We'll talk to you again. Later.
Yeah, man. Peace. Gooey, no. He's not going. Adam, you're not going.
Oh,
I'm
do
not getting
I
on
need to
this-
go?
I can kick
Hold
you
on.
out if you want. I wasn't going to do it. I didn't know if you had a joke coming or something. Didn't want to be mean.
Take care, man. There we go. Look, Sitch, I'm waiting for Sitch to join the. Here he
We're
comes.
back.
He's coming in. Yeah, there you go.
Are we on this? Are we on our stream?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. All right. Well, that was an interesting conversation.
Very cool.
Yeah. Sorry that it was just me talking for like 95%.
No, look, I was messing around with the chat. Look, no
Okay,
worries at
cool.
all. This happens often when we talk about MMT or economics.
That's
so,
true.
like,
I just walked
that's
away.
why I had to slide in there with my economic. I was surprised, man. Rekieta knows a lot about currencies.
Yeah, it's funny because
He did pretty well. He did pretty good.
Because he acknowledged he did a lot better than almost everyone that answers that question who's against fiat currency, because he acknowledged that being the dominant currency of the world makes that having the fiat currency has all the advantages, which most people don't want to admit. So
they don't want to acknowledge that, do they?
No, they don't. They don't. Yeah.
So we came up with a new character on the stream. We got Blunt Fly.
Blunt Fly. Who is Blunt Fly?
Blunt Fly is our fly smoking a blunt.
I see. And how delusional were you? Listen, it's 2:30 in the morning for me. It's not late enough for you to be so delusional that you're gonna have a fly smoking a blunt on screen. Okay.
What are you talking about? It was great. You guys were talking about serious shit. We had a smoking fly.
All right.
Flying around.
There you go. I like it. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, no, I really I like the conversation. I was interesting to me to like go through the entire scope of Nick's reasoning here. As I said, I disagree with it personally, but I understand more his position that he's arguing. Do you have any takes on any of that?
I mean, I have kind of the same disagreements as you, obviously.
Right.
I mean, I don't think this is a legitimate avenue to challenge an election.
Right.
It seems.
Well, the interesting thing is
I don't see how you can interpret it like that.
Right. Yeah, no, and I wonder too, I guess personally, it's like, even like the question that's interesting to me is just kind of the fraud question, is like, even if I think it is illegitimate, because I do think it is an illegitimate action to do, is that evidence of fraud in terms of the intent argument? Though even though I think the other charges that don't require intent, it wouldn't matter, like the conspiracy to commit false filing and the false statements don't require intent at all. So and I don't like my prediction. I don't think if this goes to trial, I don't think I would be very surprised if a judge rules or a jury rules or whoever rules on this would make a determination that like your right of free speech grants you the ability to create a false government document based on the idea that that's the only way you could redress election fraud claims. I think the argument is too complicated for most people to understand or make, and I don't think most judges would agree with that. But it's definitely an interesting argument. So,
yeah, I mean, it's based on what evidence? Just based on, just.
Well, I don't think. Well, the argument doesn't actually. I don't even think the argument relies on evidence of election fraud or not. Anyway.
Yeah, that's the problem with it.
Well, not the that's the confusing element of it. But okay.
Anyway,
PC, thank you for the 5 gifted memberships. Thank you, PC. Christian Baller for $5 says Nick won the debate against Destiny. Destiny couldn't seem to follow Nick's legal argument. Yeah, so like, because when I listen to the conversation, he didn't understand Nick's argument at first. Which as I said to Nick, I don't necessarily fault Destiny for that, because it's such a weirdly counterintuitive argument to make. And
can
also
you just lay it out as simple as possible for someone
Nick's
who might have just showed up on the stream?
Right. So Nick's
not
argument
listen to your whole argument.
Right. Let me try to. I'll try to.
So
summarize. It is complicated.
Blah,
blah, blah.
Just a simple look. 3 parts.
Let me
no
try
more than 3 parts.
Okay. Nick's
1
argument,
part. Election is stolen.
Regarding the fraud stuff, okay. Nick's argument was that fraud requires intent to deceive, right?
Yeah, I get that part.
Right. And so everyone knew, presumably, that the slate of electors were not signed off by the state. And that so therefore, if Pence has the authority to look at this slate of electors and make on his own determination in his own head about whether he thinks there was sufficient levels of fraud in his own mind or not regarding Georgia or Pennsylvania and any states, that therefore he's just legally allowed to use this alternate slate, and the false statement that they were official doesn't matter because he knows it's not he knows that that's a false statement. He's not being tricked.
Right.
I'm kind of butchering it's hard to like break it down simple, shortly or compact.
I mean, this is basically Dershowitz' argument. Like, if they use a slate of electors, then it's not fraud. It's not a fraudulent slate. He's basically saying that you're creating electors, and however those electors are created, if they're accepted, that's a legitimate way to challenge an election. I feel like you got to go down one level to the state process.
But the problem is, well, there's 2 questions. Number one, this 100% violates states' authority, right? Because you're giving authority essentially to the vice president over the state's authority to choose their electors.
Yeah, because they could just, any Yahoo could come up with a slate of electors and
hand it to Pence.
If the vice president, look,
sure.
Thank you.
Right. And to me, it does seem to be, from either both an original and a spirit argument, it's hard for me to agree that was ever intended in the 12th Amendment to give the vice president this power, right?
That's impossible for me to agree.
Yes, right.
That's
right.
Look, even original intent, I was thinking, what? Like, there's no way the original that was the original intent.
Sure. Yeah. So I wouldn't be comfortable ruling in that way if I was on the Supreme Court. But the question is, okay, so even if that's the case, even if Pence doesn't have that power, does that amount to making it fraudulent? And that's where you get kind of like bogged down in the complicated legalese argument of what it means to be fraud. So it's possible that, those charges that require the fraudulent intent, maybe it'll be more difficult to prove those. Maybe those won't stick. But I still don't think, and I think this would be very difficult. I don't see how Trump's legal team, would ever possibly get around the false statements in writing or filing false documents charges, because those don't require any sort of fraudulent intent whatsoever. It's just doing the action. And the only way that they could possibly get around that is if I think the Supreme Court ruled that Pence does have the authority to do this. If he doesn't have the authority to do this, then I don't see how Trump would escape those charges. Or Trump's
and those are state cases against Trump.
Those are state charges, right? Against
So they're basically saying you violated state law by trying to concoct these alternate electors that were by fraudulent means. That's basically the case.
They're saying that just the creation of a document
of course they are, because it's undermining their election at the state level. They're saying, look,
they're undermining
you're
their
screwing
state
with
authority.
us.
Right. They're undermining their state authority, right? They're saying just the creation of the document is a crime. Now, I don't know what all the case law is in Georgia, obviously, when those charges have been levied, but I would imagine they would fit with this situation as well. So,
but the argument, like Nick's argument, is even if they do that, as soon as Pence decides to take those electors, they go from being fraudulent to non-fraudulent.
Well, so there's 2 different things. There's 4 charges Two of the charges require fraud intent. Two of the charges, there's multiple charges, but I'm saying the charges relating to the documents, right?
These are the state charges, right?
Right. There's
I'm not
like
I'm not
20
talking about the
charges.
state. I'm not talking about the state charges.
We're only talking about the state charges.
Okay. Well, I'm saying from an election point of view, from the Destiny conversation, it sounded like he was saying once they accept the electors, even if they are fraudulent, they become real.
That was Nick's argument. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
And the determination, that's how the determination is made by the vice president.
Right. And his argument was that them lying on the document saying that they're official doesn't matter. So therefore it's not a crime. That was the argument.
Right. Look,
which I said, well, that would depend on what certificates means in terms of how it's interpreted by the Supreme Court. If they did, because if they do interpret that that certificates does mean it has to be official, then I think they're in trouble. But anyway,
it seems like they would have to, because Pence could just have some buddies cook up some electors, and
I agree.
Bring them out
Intuitively,
to
intuitively it seems like that has to be the case. I can't imagine a scenario where the vice president has the unilateral authority to just act this way. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. But what I was saying, so there's regarding the documents themselves in the Georgia case, there are 4 charges. 2 of them require this kind of defrauding intent. 2 of them don't require defrauding intent and say just the creation and action of creating the documents and filing them is the crime itself. And I'm saying I don't see how the Trump team could get away from those charges, because I don't think most judges would accept a argument that Nick brought forward, which would be an argument based on the law, but kind of on a broader principle of free speech, right? And freedom to petition the government. I would imagine most judges would not accept an argument like that or create an argument like that. So.
I don't buy that. Yeah.
Right.
Look, I created my own currency. It looks exactly like U.S. currency. Free speech.
Right. Yeah. There's interesting ways you could sort of try to push that argument onto other avenues. That's true.
Yeah.
Malcolm McKee for 5 Canadians says, ask Nick about detrimental reliance in regards to the case over which he was debating Destiny. Well, thank you. I think he brought that up on his own. So I'm pretty sure I remember him saying those words, detrimental reliance, unless I misremembered. But so
it was a good talk.
Yeah. Potentially criminal for $5 says 2024 is the year of the S-Class.
Ooh, look at that.
Thank you. Another year of great guests and good content. Thank you. And thank you. I basically dumped this on Adam's lap and said, I want to talk to Rekieta, make it happen. And Adam made it happen.
Did I produce or what?
You produced very well.
Producer extraordinaire here.
Yes.
Yeah, just made it happen.
Made it happen.
It was hilarious. Okay, Raiders cat.
Yeah.
So look, you can see he's gifting 1 sub at a time, right?
I saw that, yeah.
So, but we have like a major a-hole in the chat. He's yelling at everyone. He's pissed at everyone. I can't remember his name, but
right.
Like, it's all caps. I mean, it's all in good fun. Let's be honest here, right? But every time he's dropping one of these gifted subs, we're all like, oh no, the a-hole's going to get it.
That's funny.
Yeah, totally. So it was pretty
funny.
Hey,
I see Joe, Good Logic, and Peacekill in the chat. Hey, what's up?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
We might talk to Joe tomorrow, right?
Well, you were going to message him, so.
But he said sure, and he's in the chat right now. So yeah.
Nice. It's all set. So we're talking to Joe, Good Logic, tomorrow at
4 to 6
1 p.m.
Eastern.
What's that?
4 to 6 Eastern, 1 Western.
Oh yeah, one. There you go. Yeah, exactly right.
Hey, Sword and Scale, what's up?
Sword and Scale's in the chat too. What's up, man?
You guys came out 2:30 in the morning on a Monday to listen to us talk about legal boring shit.
Yeah, I listened. Sword and Scale. I listened to you on a podcast recently, so it's pretty cool.
Nice.
Talking about your podcast. Sword and Scale has a pretty popular podcast. Sitch.
There you go. Check it out.
He's a player.
I know. I see. He's got that big check mark next to his name. His name's all highlighted and fancy. That's the 100K. That's like if I get on my old account and like right in the chat.
Yeah.
I'm sure
So
Pisco wants to come on and tell me why he thinks Rekieta's wrong.
I'll send
We'll do
Pisco
that
the link.
No, I don't want to do that at 3 a.m.
Look,
But maybe we'll do that some point in the
Pisco
future.
wants to attack you when you're
Me?
dead tired, when you're defenseless.
Well, no, I mean, I disagree with Rekieta, so it wouldn't be attacking me. Sure, I would disagree, but
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, so it'd be good.
Yeah. If we weren't streaming tomorrow, maybe, but we are streaming tomorrow. So.
Look, it's only midnight here, so I got like
excuse me.
I got 3 hours on you.
Excuse me, yeah.
You're probably dead tired.
Yeah. Sulla for $10 says, expanding on my super chat from the other day, the Bill of Rights originally only applied to the federal government. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment applies most of the Bill of Rights to the states. And for another $10, Sulla says, that's why limiting enforcement of the whole amendment to Congress should jeopardize our rights. The Civil Rights Act of 64 was needed so they didn't have to wait for SCOTUS to stop Jim Crow. Interesting. I'm going to have to process what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think I understand.
The Bill of Rights originally only applied to the federal government. Right.
But just in relation to how that applies to whether the insurrection clause is limited only to the federal government or not.
But states can't make laws that infringe on the Bill of Rights, though, correct?
No.
Yeah.
Well, they can't now, right?
Well, could they ever?
I guess if they'd only applied to the federal government, right?
No, I think the federal government has federal law has priority over state law. The states can't make laws.
No, I know that now. But I'm saying if the Bill of Rights there's a point in time where the Bill of Rights only applied to, it was only a restriction on the federal government's ability to pass laws. Bill of Rights is restricting the government on laws they can pass.
So there was a time when it wasn't restricting state law.
Right.
Oh, okay. Well, and then there was an amendment that said, no, you state motherfuckers, you can't make laws that
I don't know if it was an amendment or a ruling or whatever, but it changed at some point in our history. It changed. Pisco says they could before, yeah. Yeah, okay. That's my understanding too.
Look, Pisco knows. There you go.
Finally
taking advantage of that legal degree.
There you go. There you go.
Helping us out in the chat.
Thank you. Zero Fox, thank you for the $1 and the shit emoji. And look at that. This is a new thing. I've never seen this before. It's the 20th ever super chat. Like, logo. You see that? That's really cool.
No, that's actually the 20th time you said number 2 in the live stream. That's what that means.
Listen. You know how many times I switched it up intentionally? You know, I said A and B a lot. All right, so.
Oh, you're right. As soon as I brought it up, I noticed. Oh, look, he's changed it.
I started switching it up. Okay.
He changed it.
Right.
That's good. Keep it fresh.
Leon Arden McGregor for the $50. Thank you so much. Says, hey y'all, Leon here, vocalist for A Fitting End, an orchestral deathcore band, and your fellow Free Will Seeker. Our new lyric video released January 6th entitled Utopia Lane in Ruins, in which I outwardly mock communism and socialism. A-Team reigns supreme.
Yes, and thank you for sharing your song. I put a link in the chat. I looked it up.
You did? Okay. Is that on YouTube? I want to check that out.
It is. Yeah. Here, look. I think I have it open. I'll put another link in the chat right now.
Mm-hmm.
Copy link address. Paste. Here you go. Look. Boom. Check it out, guys.
Awesome. I'll check that out. I do like me some deathcore and orchestral deathcore sounds pretty based. Raiders Cat, thank you for joining the Free Will Seekers, and thank you for the 1, 2, 3, 4 gift memberships.
Yes, and thank goodness the a-hole didn't get any.
That's good. I don't know who the a-hole was because I was not looking at the chat, but I'm glad they didn't get it.
We were saved.
That darn kiddeth for 10 months. Thank you. Says become a member today to provide Sitch with allergics so he can have a cat.
Oh yeah. Kidda was lusting after my cat again. But you know, just in a friendly kitty way, not like a weird sex way.
Right. You probably shouldn't use the word lusting.
I know.
Especially when you're talking about white women and pets. All right, there's some issues.
Yeah.
There.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So that's usually not with cats.
I've seen the internet memes.
Yes.
It's not pretty.
CL Brands won for $50. Thank you so much. Says, finally caught you guys live. Love your content. It's always refreshing to hear opinions that don't rely on mischaracterizing the opposition. Even if I don't agree with them, keep up the good work. And hi, Adam.
Hey, what's up? Yeah, no, that's kind of become our brand. Very difficult. A lot of people really like to mischaracterize other people's positions because, it's easier to beat them, right?
Mm-hmm. Of course.
When you just turn them into a man of straw and light them on fire.
That is how it works.
So are we good or?
We're good. Well, wait, actually, I don't know if anyone had the Streamlabs open. I don't know if anyone sent us the Streamlabs. Let me check.
I didn't notice. Lusting. Lusting. Jeez. Takes back membership.
Oh, there was one yesterday I missed, so let me read it. Smut Weasel for $6. What a name.
Smut Weasel. That's perfect.
Smut Weasel. Oh, look at this. This is a great stream. It says Sitch Mind Maze on Mind Maze on Microsoft Encarta was my shit. Love you boys. Hashtag I dream of 18. There you go.
Sweet.
There was Mind Maze was amazing. If you never had Microsoft Encarta, oh hey Aristocracy, thank you. Aristocracy in the chat said great interview. If you never had Microsoft Encarta, it was like an encyclopedia that you had back in, this is pre-internet, right? You actually had encyclopedias to try to have information.
I remember that. Yeah.
Actually, it's funny. Actually, my parents, we had like all the big Bajumbi books, the A to Z books.
Oh yeah. My parents have those too. Are you kidding me?
Yes. I'm pretty sure they got rid of them. I don't think they still have them.
Some door-to-door salesman probably came around and sold them to them.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Look,
I don't know when they
libraries.
got them. They've always been there since I remembered, but no, so there was, and then it was like 95, 96, they created, or earlier, but we had the 95, 96 versions. They had like a little CD-ROM of the encyclopedia. Oh my God, you could fit all those books on this little CD-ROM. And on Microsoft Encarta, they had this great game called Mind Maze, which all it was just like a bunch of like random trivia questions. But it was so weird because it was like really surreal because you'd go to these different rooms. It was like a maze. You go to these different rooms and there'd be all these like different characters and they all had these like really weird but like catchy, lame voice lines that they would say when you try to answer the question. So like you'd enter one room and there'd be a conquistador. He'd be like, this is a journey of the mind on God, Or you'd enter a room and there'd be a man in a gorilla suit. And he'd be like, if you got the question wrong, he'd be like, uh-oh, you owe me a banana. I don't know why. But all these like stupid little like voice lines are forever imprinted in my mind and they will never go away. So
wow.
There you go. That was Microsoft Encarta Mind Maze.
Sweet.
Learn Firm Burn Fergum. Thank you for the 200 Kazarks says good morning. Okay. That's
Look at this. Hold on. Wait a second here. Since this is a very, very special live stream, we didn't get to start with harmonica.
People want you to corn Adam Nick, and I was like, that's a bad idea.
I didn't look. I don't have that ability.
Oh, you can't do it on the Streamlabs. That's true. Yeah, okay. I'm glad.
I can't just corn him up, but
that's true.
Funny if I could. Yeah. So,
anyway.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your incredibly generous donations, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Okay.